see. If you will, go ahead and open your Bibles up to Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23 is where we'll begin the new material. It is Tuesday of the last week of Jesus' life. He'll be crucified on Friday. Monday, he cleansed the temple. Tuesday, they questioned him about what authority he's doing these things. And then Tuesday was also Stump Jesus Day. And so all of the biggest and the brightest come with their hardest questions for Jesus. How did that go? It went well for Jesus. It did not go well for those who were trying to entrap him with these questions. With every question, all his answers did was show their ignorance and their, I guess just their ignorance on things. And so the end result of it was, in verse 46, no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare to question him anymore. And so they realized that this strategy is not working, so we are not going to do this anymore. However, Jesus is not finished with them. And so now he's done some things. They ask a question. He shows their ignorance. The Pharisees came to him and he showed the coin and said, listen, what you need to be doing is you need to be giving unto God what is God's. That was their problem. So he turns it back on them there. Then the Sadducees come and have a question about the resurrection. And he just tells them, you don't know the scriptures and you don't know the power of God. Have you never read? And so kind of humiliates them there. And then a Pharisee lawyer comes and has a question for him about the greatest commandment. And he has to admit, you answered correctly on that. That's right. You gave the right answer on that. So now in chapter 23, Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples. So he's been addressing the ones asking the questions. At least in this section, it seems that he turns and he begins to deal with his disciples. And here's what he says. The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Anybody know what Moses' seat is? That's right. And so you remember that Moses would have all of the people come to him and ask all the tough questions. And finally, at the suggestion of his father-in-law Jethro, he ends up dividing that up. So only the hardest questions come to him. Well, the Jews had something similar, and they called it at Moses' seat. Interestingly, we happen to have an archaeological find of a Moses seat. This was from Chorazin, in the synagogue, in the ruins of the synagogue at Chorazin. They found, and I think inscribed on there in Hebrew is Moses' seat. And the best we can tell, one of the rabbis or Pharisees or scribes would sit there, and the people would bring their questions to them, whatever their dilemma was, and they would answer that. So this was somewhat of a civil court, small claims court, maybe something like that, So it has to do with that. So here's what Jesus says. The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. Okay? So they're acting as a civil authority, and therefore respect that authority and do whatever they say to do. But what? Don't follow their example on things, because their example is not godly. They occupy a position of authority, respect that authority, but don't do as they do. They say and they do not do. Here's what they're like. Verse 4. They bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders. They've got a lot of rules for a lot of people. They got a lot of things about how everything should be done, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. So they're interested in telling everybody else how they need to be living and doing, but they don't apply that to themselves. And so don't follow their example. Now, you would expect maybe that what Jesus would say here is, since they're being hypocritical, you don't have to listen to them. But that's not what he says, which I think is interesting, because how do you feel when somebody who's in authority is telling you to do something, but they're not doing it themselves? Do you feel like doing that? Does it feel like it's acceptable to dismiss that since they're not doing it themselves? Yeah. And that's not what Jesus says. And so going back to kind of the tax question, it seems like, well, we shouldn't have to pay taxes if the government's being corrupt in the way that they're using it or spending it. Was that Jesus's answer? No, you respect it. Well, if the scribes and the Pharisees are hypocrites, still respect their authority that they have on I think it's civil authority more than religious authority here on this. But you have to respect it on that.
They just don't practice what they preach.
They just don't practice what they preach. So what do you call that?
Hypocrite.
And how many times does Jesus use that term in this? I didn't count it up, but a lot. He hammers away at that word in this chapter. Any thoughts or comments through verse 4?
Do you think this maybe helps me frame it. Do you think the people generally approved of the Pharisees and their preaching and their practices?
I really don't know.
I just wonder, like, when Jesus says, don't do what they do, I wonder if he's thinking, like, don't try to play the game like they're playing it.
Yes.
So, like, oh, these are the Pharisees. That must be how we say nice things. We want to appear nice, but we don't really have to worry about it. So I wonder if, like, the people generally approve of the Pharisees and saying, don't play the game they play. That's not who they are.
Yes, I like the way you worded that, because I think that the very next verse, verse 5, explains what the real problem is here. The real problem is what they do. Why do they do it? That's right. So that's what this is to them. So you phrased it, how they play the game. And the way they're playing the game is, I want to appear before men to be righteous. I want everybody to think highly of me. That's what this is about. Serving God is about looking good in front of other people. And that's their mentality. And that's the problem. And so they may be telling you right things to do. The problem is they've got the whole game wrong, because they may be doing some right things, but they're doing it for the wrong reason. So you think back, Jesus had talked earlier in the Sermon on the Mount about doing charitable deeds. Is it good to do charitable deeds? What about if you're only doing it so people will praise you for it? Is it good to pray? What if you're only doing it so people will notice how righteous you are? No. And so that was the mentality of how they were playing the game. Don't be like that.
That's all they knew. Like what you are saying, kind of. I think sometimes I've thought about maybe new Christians, especially people who have not been going to church. They're when they become Christians and something, when they start attending somewhere, they watch what other people do, and it might be easy for them to think, judge what they should be doing,
sure,
what others are doing instead of what God's word says. You know what I mean?
But I mean, maybe I'm going to go out on a limb here. Haven't nearly all of us felt that before, though? That's the way the game is supposed to be played. That you look good in front of your brethren. You make sure that you're doing the right things, and your language changes a little bit, your actions change a little bit when you're around brethren, because you want to. That's what it's about, right? It's about everybody thinking, hey, I'm doing. I think about comments that are just common. Somebody says something, and the joke is, well, now don't say that here in the church building. You can't get away with it here. And it's like, so it'd be okay somewhere else, but not here, because it's almost like, well, that's how the game's played. The game's played is when we're around brethren, we behave this way, and when we're not. And so you were talking about somebody new comes along and they see that and they think, well, that's what religion is.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we have a response. We need to be careful. People who have been Christians longer need to be cognizant of that, but also we need to make sure that we're pointing people to God's word and not saying, do what I do. I know in some ways we do that because Paul said do it, but only as I'm doing what the Bible says.
That's right. So Dwight and I were talking right before we got started. And I mentioned to him, I think this chapter is really important for understanding what's valuable to Jesus, how Jesus feels about things. And what we really need to understand is, if we want to please Jesus, we need to know what he likes and what he dislikes. Do you get any idea from this chapter, anything he likes and dislikes? This is one of those chapters, You know, where you kind of sarcastically or ironically want to say to him, well, now, Jesus, tell us how you really feel. We're not sure how you really feel about this hypocrisy thing and doing things just to be seen of men. And Jesus is very blunt, and so he has very strong feelings about that. Do you think he still has very strong feelings about that? Absolutely. And so when we read this today, the application needs to be, look, if I'm going to be pleasing to Jesus, I need to make sure that I'm not playing the game like the scribes and the Pharisees played it, because the Lord does not like that.
These are really educated men. You know, supposed to be educated men, and the people do follow them. So they have respect for them. And I don't know if anybody's led them to believe any other way until Jesus speaks to them.
Right.
Particularly the scribes. They're supposed to be the teacher.
Right. The scribes are supposed to know the law better than anybody. And so, but it became about, something else besides really pleasing God. Okay. Verse 5. All their works they do to be seen of men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places in the feast and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplace and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. So a couple of things that are of interest here that may need a little explanation. They make their phylacteries broad. Does anybody know what a phylactery is? That's exactly right. Let's say, I think I've got a slide here. You can see it a little bit on these guys up here. They got these boxes strapped to their foreheads here. And they also would often, if you go to the Western Wall today in Jerusalem, you will see Orthodox Jews there, and they'll have the phylactery, some of them, and they'll have the leather bands around their hand. And let me tell you where that, you don't have to turn there, but let me go back real quickly to Deuteronomy chapter 6, because I think this is helpful in kind of understanding how the scribes and the Pharisees are playing the game. And I want you to think about this. If anybody know where Deuteronomy is? Is it in the Old Testament? Old Testament, okay. All right, Deuteronomy chapter 6 in verse in verse 5 it says, in verse 6 it says, and these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. And then verse 8 says, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. All right, somebody interpret that for me. What do you think that means? Should be before you always. Okay. Should be close to you. Well, how can you know if I have God's word always before me? By my character. That's a lot of work. What if I just strapped the box on my forehead and tucked some scripture in there and I had it right? Then you could see that, man, he's a religious guy. Look at that. He has that right there all the time. And he's got it bound around his hand all the time. And what if Dwight had one of those and I looked at his and I thought, well, I want to appear more righteous than Dwight. What can I do? I can make a bigger box. I can make a bigger box and put it on my forehead. Then you know that I'm really serious about it. Do you see what's happening? I mean, it's comical to think about. It's really comical to think about, but they were doing this seriously. And the point of Deuteronomy was, I want this to be in your heart, and I want it to guide everything that you do, to be part of your life in every way. And what they have reduced this down to is we strap some scripture on our forehead and wrap it around our hand, and that way everybody can see that we are really righteous in this. Yes, because we got it covered. We've already shown everybody that we're righteous by what we're doing. And so that was part of it. And then it talks about the borders of their garment. It could be the hems of their robes or whatever, but more than likely the law said about having tassels to remember their covenant with the Lord. So what they would do is they would make sure that their whole garment was just covered with tassels so that everybody would see, oh boy, they really remember that they belong to the Lord on this. And so what Jesus is accusing them of is they're all about the outward show, but that's it. That's it. And don't let that be what your emphasis is. Don't let that be how you play the game of being devoted to the Lord.
I read where they like to be called rabbi twice instead of just rabbi. They wanted people to call them rabbi for some reason. That was just.
I like the sound of that. Say it again, please. Yes, that may. Yeah, I've not thought of that before, but yeah, that's right. And what about verse 6? What are they like? Yeah, I want to be in the seat of importance here. So it's all about when you're invited to something. You know, in the synagogue, you had most synagogues were a semicircle, and the really important people sat near the center of that circle, from what I understand, and around. So, you know, you kind of elbow your way in there to be in that really important place. Kind of like we still have a very mild version of this, sitting at the head of the table. Well, the person at the head of the table has some weight to it, you know, some significance to it. So it's that. Well, they're jostling for that. You know, they're fighting for that. We want to be in that position where we are recognized as important in that. So they love the best seats in the synagogue and at the feast, because everybody recognizes, oh, they must be important. And then the greetings, they want to be called by some title in that. And that's really what's at heart here, is recognize me as something. And you think about how this is spilt over into modern religion. A religious authority wants to be called reverend, or you know, some title with that. And Jesus is just making the point, that's for show. Don't let that be what it's about. That's not what it's supposed to be. So verse 9, do not call anyone on earth. I'm sorry, we skipped verse 8. But you do not be called rabbi. Okay, so what does rabbi mean? It means teacher. Okay. But what he's saying is, don't take on titles that show I'm above you. I've got authority over you. I'm more important in some way. I'm more knowledgeable in some way. So don't use that title in that way for yourselves. One is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. And do not call anyone on earth your father. Is it talking about like your biological father? No. For there is one who is your father, and he is in heaven. And do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. So do we ever call each other teachers? What are Dwight and I? Yeah. Do Dwight and I ask when you come in that you would address us as teacher? Why? We are teachers in this setting, but we're not in some way your spiritual superiors that you have to look to us for all the answers. And I think that's what they were desiring to be. By the way, Paul would tell Timothy that he was his true son in the faith, and that he was a father to him in that. And I think he was talking about as a spiritual mentor to him. But he did not have the attitude of the religious leaders here. Can you give me an example, a modern day example of someone having the attitude of the religious leaders here with titles?
The Catholics.
Yes. And how do you address those in authority? Father, you know, and they make it very clear. No, spiritually, we are the ones. And that is that to me, that I don't know how you get around what's being said here on that, because that's not the spirit. That's not the attitude. So that idea of clergy and laity that's presented here, Jesus says, no, there's one that is your teacher. That is Christ. There's one who is your father, and you are all brethren. And so there's not clergy and laity. You're all equal in that. And so don't play the game in trying to compete to show who's superior in that.
That's why we don't call our preachers reverend.
Mm-hmm.
We're all in this together.
That's right. All right, any other thoughts through verse 9?
Let me ask a question. I want to go back to that, telling you what to do and not doing. Do you think that they thought they were above the law?
I'm sure they would say no. but certainly they had taken upon themselves to add all kinds of new laws. Well, I would say yes, they did think they were above the law, because you remember Jesus gave an example of that, didn't he? That he said, the law says to honor your father and mother, but you've made void the law by your traditions that you exalted above the law. Okay. Any other thoughts through verse 9? So he's talking to his disciples, and he's saying, don't be like them in this regard. And I really do like the way that Austin framed that. Don't play the game that way, because that's not what it's about. It's not what it's about. So verse 11, he who is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be abased, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Boy, that theme just runs all the way through the scripture. And here it is again, and Jesus making that point that if you want to be noticed by God and exalted by God, then you are going to have to be humble. But if you try to do what they're doing, God's going to bring you down.
Over in Matthew 20, we just saw that. Yet it shall be not so among you, but whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. That was Jesus speaking that.
Mm-hmm. Now Jesus is going to talk to the scribes and the Pharisees directly. He's been telling his disciples and the multitude not to be like them, but now he's going to tell them exactly what the problem is. And there's a series of 8 woes that is to be given to them. What does woe mean? Not like, whoa, Nelly. Not that kind of woe. It's bad. Bad. I got bad tidings for you. Bad news. Woe unto you, because bad is coming to you. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. So, what are they doing? They're misleading people. So they're not willing to be what God intends for them to be. And by their teaching, they're stopping other people from being that as well. So they're blocking up the doors of the kingdom by their hypocrisy.
We saw that they threatened to throw people out of the synagogue.
Yeah, good example. Good example. Very good. Verse 14, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you shall receive greater condemnation. So here's one of those situations where they're devouring widows' houses. What do you take that to mean?
Taking them away.
Yeah. And so I don't know in what means they're doing this, but here is a widow who doesn't have anybody to protect her and care for her and provide for her, and they should have compassion and pity. And what are they doing? In some ways, they're taking advantage of her and devouring her whatever she has left. And so there's no love being shown here. But we know they're righteous. How do we know they're righteous? Because they have such long prayers. They just stand out on that street corner and pray and pray and pray and pray. And Jesus says, let me tell you what they're going to get for that. They're going to get greater condemnation. Because what they're really doing is just dragging God's name through the mud by that. When a person pretends to be a child of God and then abuses and mistreats others, that makes God look even worse than if they didn't acknowledge him at all. And they will receive a greater condemnation there. Thoughts or comments? Verse 15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte. What's a proselyte? Yes, to convert a Gentile over to Judaism so that they will accept the law. You work really hard to do that, and when he's won over, you make him twice as much the son of hell as yourself. You just train him in the same hypocritical practices that you yourself are in, and make him even worse. And so here's all this effort that is being spent to honor God by bringing the nations to God. And yet what you're really doing is you're teaching them to abhor the law. Verse 16, woe to you blind guides who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he's obligated to perform it. I think we've addressed this before, but this is that idea of basically what God said is honor your oaths and your vows. Keep your word. What they've done is they have broken it down to technicalities of how you can get away with saying something, even swearing something, depending on what you swear it by, whether you had to keep it or not. So if you swear it by the name of Yahweh, well, you got to keep that. But if you can maybe shield that somehow and make it look like you're swearing by Yahweh, but not really be swearing by Yahweh, then it may be you don't have to keep that. So they've got all of these technicalities down by this. So if you swear by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he's obligated to perform that. I don't know how they got that. Verse 17, fools and blind. For which is greater, the gold of the temple or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gift that is on the altar, he's obligated to perform it. Fools and blind. For which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? And so Jesus makes his point. Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. He who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on the throne. Basically what Jesus says, if you say you're going to do something, you give your word on something, it doesn't matter what you swear by. You're still before God saying that you're going to do this and therefore do it. But that's not what they were teaching. They were teaching, no, you can get around this if you say the right words. And Jesus is saying, no, you say anything that you agreed to do or agreed not to do, it was before God. Keep your word. Keep your word. Thoughts or comments through that section?
Sounds like they valued the gold more than they did the house of God, the house of truth.
Yeah.
You know, gold was tangible, but you know, this is just
Yeah. Yeah.
you know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah.
Lonnie, what was the one that you did before you went to verse 15? It was
The widows.
yeah.
It's
Do you have the ESV?
Yeah, the ESV leaves out verse.
It
4.
leaves
Okay, that's
it
what I
out,
was
yeah.
going
It leaves out verse 14.
It says it's in some manuscripts.
Okay. Yeah. I do have a footnote on that. That's right.
I have
Yes.
2 questions. One's going to back up.
Okay.
So, when it says twice the son of hell as yourself, why twice?
I don't know. I guess they're just
It wasn't bad enough now to,
yeah, and maybe that's it. Is that it was bad enough that you were doing it, and now you got 2 people doing it, so it's twice as bad. But it seems that they're twice the son of hell. In other words, they're worse than they were, and maybe it is that idea that with every successive generation, the corruption is getting worse. I don't know.
Well, if they were a Gentile, they were considered already not saying part of the kingdom, the Jewish kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
So they were already considered one then. And then if they were brought in and they still were not,
Yeah.
twice.
Yeah. Okay.
It meant that they would be twice the child because they were taught the wrong thing.
Yeah.
You didn't do them any favors.
Yeah. So Jesus is basically saying, They were-
already lost, and now you make
you're making them worse than they were. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the way I was.
Yeah. Okay.
my second question is this. How is this system supposed to work? When they say, like, well, if you swear by this, it's nothing. If you swear by this, you have to keep it. Would this be a system that would work primarily when they're dealing with Gentiles? Because if they're teaching this, I assume all the Jews would know the game, right? All the Jews would know, oh, well, they swore by the altar. They're not going to keep that. But if they swore by the gold or the gift, then they have to keep those things. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't really know. I take it that, so we were talking about the seat of Moses, that this is where a lot of those disputes would come. But he swore to me. Well, what I swore by was, oh, well, if he swore by that, so I don't know. That's the way I've taken it, imagined it. But I really don't know the answer whether this was primarily towards the Gentiles or I've taken it that it was probably Jews dealing with each other in this type of way. Yes, I think so. I think so. That they had reduced it down to just a series of technicalities, and
I think
so
that lends a lot to what Gerald was saying about what they're truly valuing.
Mhm.
Right? They're valuing. So we know earlier Pharisees are lovers of money. But what are they valuing? They're valuing the gold. They're valuing the gifts, not the things that really truly matter.
Yeah.
Or would make those things sacred.
Yep. Anything else through 22? All right, verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint, anise, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. So the law said that you are to give a tithe of all that you possess. And so if you have 20 acres of wheat, you give a tenth of that as a tithe. But what if you just have a few garden herbs? You give a tenth of that as well. And yet that may seem small, but the Pharisees were careful to do that and to teach that, listen, if you've got a little mint plant there on your kitchen windowsill, you make sure to give a tenth of that. That was good. But what did they not pay any attention to? Some of the foundational principles of the law, like judgment and justice or mercy and faith. Those things they kind of let slip. They weren't as careful about that. And so you would think if they're so careful to tithe their garden herbs that they would be very careful on those major principles of the law. But they were not. They were not. Which brings Jesus to his second point here that I love the imagery of it. You blind guides, you strain out a what? Okay, so a gnat was the smallest of the unclean animals. And to make sure that we don't accidentally eat something that is unclean, we're going to put like cheesecloth over our cup so a gnat doesn't fly in there. You ever had that happen? You got your iced tea out in summertime and you look down, oh, there's some gnats backstroking in there. And you don't want to drink. Well, we're going to make sure that doesn't happen because that's unclean. We don't want to eat that. And so we cover that. A camel was one of the largest unclean animals. We're going to swallow that thing whole. Now, obviously, Jesus is exaggerating here. But he's saying that's what it's like. When you're being so meticulous and careful about this, but then you're not paying attention to justice, mercy, and faith, which are some of the core principles of the law, it's like you're being careful not to swallow a gnat, but then you're eating a whole camel. That's the point that he's making. Now, what is his solution to this? Do it all. This you should do without leaving the other undone. And so I hear people all the time, no, not all the time, but I've heard people before quote from this passage, and it's like, man, don't sweat all of that, all the details of everything. Just get the big principles down and you don't have to worry about the little things. That's not what Jesus says. Jesus says, do it all. Be careful about all of it. It's all of God's law. So be careful about it. And this is a hard balance for us to strike. I think I see this with the denominational world. I see this with brethren. I see this in myself of swinging to one extreme or the other. And sometimes in reaction to the other. It's like we see people and they're ignoring big things. And so we get where we're only emphasize the small things. And then sometimes we see that, that the small things are being emphasized and the big things are being neglected. And then all of a sudden we say, well, the small things, we shouldn't even focus on that. Or else we should focus on the big things. And I don't think that's right. We need to have the same respect for all of what God says. That's how Jesus feels about it. So I love this chapter because I'm getting some insight into how Jesus feels about a lot of things. And Jesus doesn't want me to be slack on the little things. And he doesn't want me to be negligent on the big things either. He just wants me to have the proper respect for all of God's law.
How do you define justice?
So that word here, some translations say judgment. And so I think sometimes people think of this as justice and making sure that widow back here doesn't have her house taken away from her. And I think that would be true as well. But it's also making sure that the guilty are punished correctly. And so it's the idea of making sure that right is accomplished in that. Making sure that people keep their oaths. And just all the way through that, I think is part of it. So, thoughts? Yes, sir, Timmy.
Do people do? You kind of started on it. Do people do that today? They make sure they pay that 10%. There's organizations that make sure they pay their 10%. Or I've heard that.
Right.
But you're not fair with people. You lie and cheat and steal to get what you got. Do people do that? Sure they do. You don't help anybody. And then you don't even worship God at all. That sounds like what he's saying to me.
Yeah.
Talking to us.
Right.
It's hard.
Well, this chapter, we can get lost at the beginning. We're thinking, okay, well, I don't know what this has to do with us. We don't have Pharisees running around with boxes on their head and tassels and everything. How does this relate to? Wow, it does, doesn't it? This really resonates with what we see. Certainly what we see may be abused in the greater religious world, but it hits closer to home than that too.
Paying your 10% or paying your tithes does not put you above the law.
Right.
That's what I said earlier.
Yep.
I think Micah 6 be helpful with this.
Read it.
So it says, he's told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, or mercy, and to walk humbly with your Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the judgment, justice, mercy, kindness, faithfulness, walk humbly with your Lord.
That's right.
It's, people who are not Christians, I have a friend that's agnostic and or acquaintance more, I guess. But anyway, and she's very observant of hypocrisy in Christians.
Yeah.
Or the world, the religious world, I would say. Those who follow Jesus to some, if you think that people don't see it, now I know it's an excuse. I know that people use it as an excuse not to look for truth or to follow the Lord. I know that. But we shouldn't be giving them that reason.
Yes.
And maybe she's overly, observant, or like she's really watching. But you don't want to give somebody anything.
Yeah.
And not because you're just trying to win something, but you don't want to. You have a responsibility to them, even in that. Even if they don't want it, but you still have responsibility.
I think it's easy for the world to see the hypocrisy in religious people because they're observing what they're saying and then they're observing their actions. I think it's harder for religious people to see the hypocrisy in themselves because were the Pharisees working hard? They were working hard religiously. When you work hard at something, how do you feel? You feel good about yourself, and I worked hard at that, and you feel justified, and so you can overlook or miss those things that the world would clearly see. Yeah, you may be working hard, but it's not lining up with what you're saying. Where we just kind of get lost in, well, I'm working hard at it. I'm doing this. I can give you a checklist of all the things that I've done. You remember the Pharisee praying in the temple? And Lord, I thank you. I'm not like the publican. I fast. I do this. I give 10%. He's got all this checklist that justifies him because he's worked so hard at all of this. And yet he misses the blatant discrepancies between what he's claiming and what he's practicing. And so I do think it's much easier for the world to see that hypocrisy in us than it is for us to see it in ourselves. All right, anything else through 24? Verse 25. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Okay, so what are the things that he mentions here that's the problem? Greed. And did it say what? Self-indulgence and greed. Okay. So here the focus is on material things. The focus is on self. And it's not on serving God. It's not on loving God or loving neighbor. Neither of those are under consideration. But what do they make the outside of the cup look like? Yes. We are so charitable. Remember when I stood on the street corner and blew the trumpet and gave away all of that money? How did y'all miss that? But what's really inside is greed and self-indulgence. And so what's the solution here? Yeah. Start working on your real motivation. Work on your real motivation. And you know what happens when you get that right? Your actions are going to follow and take care of themselves.
This would be similar to, it's not what goes into the body that defiles man, but what comes out.
Mm-hmm.
They were talking about the apostles.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, very good. So here's another illustration. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. And I love some visual demonstration of this, because you walk past this and here's a tomb and they've got a fresh coat of paint on it and it looks nice and you wouldn't even mind sitting on that, would you? But do you know what's inside of that? If you open that up, you know what you would see? And it would be disgusting. It would be disgusting. That's the image. That's what's going on in your heart. That's what's going on in your mind and in your life. That's not the way you're appearing. You're working real hard to dress it up and make it look good. But the truth is, you're not doing well. Outwardly, you appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Any thoughts there?
Lacquer's in the 10%, looks good.
Yes, that's right. Looks good. All right. Well, we got one more woe to go, and but we're going to have to wait. We ran out of time, and so we'll pick up in verse 29 next time. We'll finish up with his discussion of their hypocrisy, and then we're going to shift and we're going to look at what their hypocrisy is bringing upon the whole nation. And what the end result of that's going to be. Whoa, 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 whoa. What's going to happen here? Jesus is about to get to that. We'll pick up there next time. Thank you for your good attention. Good comments. Appreciate it. Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact